Toutes et à tous. My name is Diane Sachs. I have the honor of being your Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. I am an independent, nonpartisan officer appointed by all of the members of Provincial Parliament to report to the Ontario Legislature. I am the guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights, and I am required to report to the Legislature each year on at least these three topics: energy, environment, and Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions. This is my third annual report to the Legislature on Ontario's climate-changing pollution. As expected, the impacts of climate change continue to become more visible each year. It's not just about polar bears anymore. It's not just about remote islands and sea level. It isn't even just about how difficult we are making the future lives of our children and our grandchildren. Now climate change is affecting us. Extreme weather did not start with climate change, but climate change increases the risk of heat, fires, storms, floods, and other extreme events here and around the world. Just think about the year we've just had. Ontario alone has had about $1 billion in insured losses from catastrophic weather so far in 2018, and probably families and organizations have had at least as much again in uninsured losses. Our sweltering summer culminated in devastating tornadoes ripping through the Ottawa Valley. Our forest fires affected many Ontarians, while even more people faced catastrophic fires and wildfire smoke in British Columbia, in California, in the Arctic, and around the world. Other Ontarians have suffered from flooding or watched family and friends suffer from catastrophic storms and flooding in the Carolinas, in India, in the Philippines, and elsewhere. Meanwhile, Lyme disease is spreading. Infrastructure is weakening. The heat building up in Ontario lakes and rivers has left many of them choked with algae, beaches closed, and fish stressed. Most Ontarians do not yet realize that Ontario is warming faster than most of the world. Ontario has already warmed by 1.5 degrees Celsius, half again as much as the world average, and can expect another 2.5 to 3.7 degrees in just the next 30 years. That much warming is likely to bring much wilder weather. More wind damage, worse tornadoes, worse floods, worse droughts, worse heat waves, worse forest fires. Up to 10% of Canadian properties may soon be too high risk for private sector flood insurance if protective measures are not taken. So we must get ready for what's ahead. But by itself, that will not be enough. If unchecked, climate pollution will probably drive the weather beyond our ability to adapt. So Ontario, like people everywhere around the world, must both reduce the climate pollution we emit to minimize future damage and get ready for what's ahead. Until June, Ontario was generally on the right track, partly due to good government policy. By 2016, our greenhouse gas emissions fell to their lowest level ever reported, while Ontario's population and economy grew. We were growing conservation and clean electricity, the lowest cost pathways to a sustainable economy. With significant effort over many years, Ontario had grown a clean tech sector with 5,000 companies, 130,000 employees, and nearly $20 billion in revenue every year, including exports of $1 billion a year. My report, Climate Action in Ontario, What's Next?, shows that Ontario's climate law, including cap and trade, was working to drive down emissions, to bring money into Ontario, and to fund sensible solutions. There have been some suggestions that cap and trade money was being taken unjustly from Ontario families and businesses, and then wasted or used unfairly. That's not what I found. As I've shown in Appendix B, most of the money from cap and trade was funding fossil fuel efficiency programs in communities across Ontario, helping schools, public housing, transit, and hospitals, among others, become more efficient and save millions of dollars in energy costs. Cap and trade lasted only 18 months in Ontario, not long enough for a $2 billion a year program to turn around an $800 billion a year economy. But even in that very short period of time, we saw encouraging signs. 550 organizations, most of them funded by taxpayers, were encouraged and helped to become more efficient. Hospitals alone were on track to slash their climate pollution and their operating costs by $60 million a year, money they would be able to put back into patient care. For example, St. Joseph's General Hospital in Elliott Lake replaced its old heating and cooling systems and will now save $300,000 every year in energy costs. Similar stories are becoming apparent in a wide range of public services. Energy efficiency, funded by Cap and Trade at Mohawk College in Hamilton, for example, will save it $360,000 a year. The Greater Sudbury Housing Corporation got funds to install made-in-Ontario energy management upgrades in 2 of its older apartment buildings. Now the residents are more comfortable, summer and winter, plus the building energy bills have been cut about in half. 26 Toronto community housing apartment buildings received long overdue energy retrofits, which will save that hard-pressed community housing provider $57 million in energy costs over the next 20 years. These are good examples of the win-win-win climate actions that we're starting to take off in Ontario. Meanwhile, the carbon allowance market we shared with California and Quebec brought an extra $250 million into Ontario, and corporate investors matched 4-to-1 cap and trade funds to make their Ontario facilities more competitive. So we had a climate law and programs that were working. Now we don't. This summer, as Ontarians sweltered, Ontario gutted most of its climate change programs. Contrary to the government's obligation under the Environmental Bill of Rights, there was no consultation with Ontarians as the rug was pulled out from under climate programs and as clean energy projects were cancelled all over Ontario, leaving, among others, many First Nation communities high and dry. Dismantling a climate change law that was working is bad for the environment. It's bad for our health. It's even bad for business. Where do we go from here? The government's proposed replacement climate law, Bill 4, the Cap and Trade Cancellation Act, is much too weak. A meaningful climate law needs at least 3 critical elements: long-term science-based, legally enforceable emission budgets, consistent with the Paris Agreement, a legal obligation to stay within those budgets, and credible, transparent reporting to keep the work on track. It should use the 3 tools that work: polluter pay, investing in solutions, and regulations to drive down emissions and build a cleaner, more sustainable economy. And it must focus on large emission sources which have real technology alternatives. If you look at page 41 of my report, you'll see all the stats. The largest source of emissions in Ontario isn't industry. It's individuals. And industry has no technology alternatives for about half their emissions. Bill 4 has none of the features of a good climate law. Instead, it promises undetermined action to achieve undetermined and easily changed targets at some undetermined future time with no criteria and no consequences. It's a license to do little or nothing in the face of our largest threat. Ontario can do better. Even without cap and trade, Ontario can still choose sensible solutions that help families make ends meet while bringing climate pollution down dramatically. At the same time, we can clean the air, reward innovation, keep money in Ontario, and promote more efficient use of energy. Energy costs are a real challenge for many families. And the government has multiple ways to help them make ends meet, while also fighting climate change, improving public health, and building a sustainable economy. There are more choices for polluter pay than cap and trade. Polluter pay tools are popular around the world because they give everyone more choice and a fair incentive to reduce climate pollution, and the revenue allows government to help families and businesses reduce how much fossil fuel they need to buy. Sometimes they send checks to individuals, which could leave most families better off, or give families a break on other taxes. If instead the government chooses to push down the prices of fossil fuels, they make it cheaper to put climate pollution into the air we all depend on. When pollution is free, we can expect to have more of it, and more of the climate damage that it causes. Cheaper fossil fuels keep Ontario dependent on importing $11 billion in fossil fuels every year and throw away the lowest cost pathways to a sustainable economy. Plus, they harm human health. Tailpipe pollution from fossil-fueled vehicles is a major health risk, especially for people who live near busy roads, a threat that is now unnecessary. My report also shows that the government is not getting ready for the climate change impacts that Ontarians are starting to see. Ontario needs a solid long-term plan to adapt our communities for the weather that's here and the warmer, wilder weather that's ahead. It will cost much more if we don't start now, and no one is sure who will pay. Now is not the time to abandon action on climate change. It's time to step it up. This is our use it or lose it moment. Will we turn our back on our word, on our obligations, and the immense opportunities to build a better future? Or will we join other governments around the world and address this crisis with the courage and resolve it deserves? Ontarians all over this beautiful province tell me they are ready to act on climate change, but the government needs to lead. The recommendations included in my report chart a way forward, looking for the lowest cost options. Our window for action is closing, and soon it will be too late. The proposed Cap and Trade Cancellation Act, Bill 4, is posted for public comment on Ontario's Environmental Registry. If Ontarians want a stronger climate law and policy, we need to speak up now. I encourage all Ontarians to comment on this proposal by the October 11th deadline, which is only about 2 weeks away. Thank you. Merci. Any questions?
Do you have an understanding of the impact canceling cap and trade has without having an immediate replacement? Like, how far back are we sliding in our emissions targets by having this sort of vacuum?
But it always takes a while before we get actual emission reporting. There's a long delay in the federal process, but I think we will have suffered dramatically. 752 clean energy projects that all had contracts and were part of the long-term energy plan have now been canceled. The economic modeling that we commission shows that energy conservation and clean electricity are the cheapest ways to a sustainable low-carbon economy, and we've just dramatically turned away from doing exactly those things. So
when you say suffered dramatically, do you mean in lack of progress on emissions?
Well, I think we may even see worse than that. That our population is growing, our GDP is growing. We're anticipating adding 4 to 5 million more people in the next 20-25 years. All of those people are going to be looking for some ways to turn the lights on. Last year, 2017, we know that 96% of our electricity was essentially emission-free. But canceling clean energy projects hampers our ability to provide clean electricity going forward. So if electricity demand goes up and we've canceled our clean electricity, that means we're going to go back to fossil fuel-fired electricity. That'll put our emissions back up just from electricity. And we do know, and as I reported, electricity has been the main place in which we've seen real progress over the last 20 years, although there have also been some reductions from industry. Every other sector's emissions have gone up. So if we give up on the programs that were going to bring emissions down in transportation and in buildings, and we allow our emissions from electricity to go back up, while we grow our population and our economy, yes, I think our emissions are going to go up. I think we're going to be getting farther and farther from where we need to be just as climate change begins to really punish the people of Ontario.
You've previously stated that there's basically two main ways for regions to hit their climate targets. There's carbon pricing, and there's more regulations. Can you cite any regions or jurisdictions in the world that have achieved or are on track to hit their targets without using one of those two steps?
No. The three main tools that work are some kind of polluter pay, some kind of polluter pay, which doesn't have to be carbon pricing. There are other options, investing in solutions, and regulations. Regulations certainly can and do work. California, for example, is on track for achieving its goals, and most of that is probably coming from regulations. In Ontario, most of what we've accomplished since 1990, well, really since 2000, has been due to regulations. Regulations work, we know they do. But they tend to be somewhat more expensive for an economy than the things you can do with polluter pay, because polluter pay really stimulates and rewards innovation, efficiency, gives everyone an opportunity to do their best, and they come up with all kinds of interesting things that we wouldn't necessarily have thought of. You know, in the old days when I wrote regulations, those of us who sat around the table didn't know everything, and we did our best, but it turned out that the people of the province know lots of other things. So regulations can certainly work by themselves, but they tend to be more expensive than they need to be.
Have you looked at, you say that Ontario will suffer dramatically, but what is the counterbalance of the federal carbon tax?
So we do have a chapter in here about why not just leave it to the federal government. And certainly if and when the federal government implements its carbon tax, it will recreate an incentive for emission reductions for many people in the economy. It doesn't apply to all the same people, and it doesn't apply in all the same way. And of course, for some people in Ontario, it will be much more, in fact, for many people in Ontario, it will be much more expensive, because the cost of cap and trade was much lower than the federal carbon tax will be. The net effect on families will depend a lot on what the government does with the money. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has reported on this, and there are many studies around the world. The kinds of things governments can do with the money. One thing they can do is a carbon fee and dividend. They can send checks to every family, and we've just seen the report, Mark Cameron's report, that most Ontario families would end up better off if they choose that. Parliamentary Budget Officer has suggested that yes, and you could have less damage to the economy as a whole, in other words, less loss in GDP, if instead you reduced distortionary taxes. So there's other ways of helping families besides just sending people a check, but people might like getting a check. You could also use some of the money to help promote emission reduction, support technology, provide upfront capital for people who don't have access to capital, like low-income housing. So there's a lot of different things that government can do with the money, and what it does with the money will have an enormous impact, both on its economic effect and on its environmental effect. But yes, if we, I reported previously that I thought cap and trade was better for Ontario. It gave people more time to adapt, it provided more flexibility, it allowed more of the emission reductions to be made in the part of the economy where they were cheaper. But we don't have that anymore, so if we don't have that, a federal carbon tax can do a lot of the same things. It's more expensive, but it can still work.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so this government
Could you
is...
speak up, please?
Sorry. This government says it's going to challenge the federal government's carbon tax in court, so
Yes, is
what
that
do
a
you make
question?
of that?
Well, far be it from me to prejudge what the Supreme Court will decide, but I know that the Manitoba government commissioned a very extensive legal opinion on the validity of the federal carbon tax. I've read that opinion. I'm not a constitutional law expert, but it seemed to make sense to me, and that opinion concluded that the federal tax would survive a legal challenge. But that's up to the Supreme Court to decide, not to me.
Can you talk a bit about the criteria of a proper and lawful consultation under the Environmental Bill of Rights?
Yes.
And whether or not the government is currently fulfilling its obligation?
Well, we're much better off now than we were a couple of months ago. I'm really pleased to see Minister Phillips recognizing his legal obligations under the Environmental Bill of Rights and putting the bill out for comment. The absolute legal minimum for public consultation is 30 days. The government allowed 30 days for this. It has been traditional for major topics that are of significant public import to provide more time. And of course, many people didn't know on September 11th that the document had been posted that day, so it can take people some while to consult. The key elements of the Environmental Bill of Rights are that we can't just rely on elections to get good environmental decisions. We've had democratic elections in Ontario for more than a century and a half. But what we really learned is government can't necessarily be trusted to make good decisions that are in the best interest of the environment. That's why we have an Environmental Bill of Rights. And the essence of the bill is that the government has to tell people in detail what it's proposing to do, give them the supporting information, give them a fair opportunity to comment on it, take those comments into account seriously, tell the public what they've done with those comments, and then act on it. So we're partway there. The bill has been posted for public comment. What the government hasn't done in that consultation is tell people actually what it plans to do. It's very difficult for people to comment without knowing what government really means to do. So it's an important opportunity. It's very important that your readers, that your listeners know if they want to have a voice on this, if they value having a voice, this is the time to speak up, because at the moment we only have until October 11th.
Were you concerned that it took a lawsuit for the comment period to start?
I do not have any privileged insight into why the government decided to finally post. It's better late than never. As you know, there has already been extensive debate in the legislature on the bill. As late as a week ago, the government wasn't prepared to commit that they would even wait till October 11th to see what people had to say before they would pass the bill. Judging from the minister's comments yesterday and this morning, he is now interested in what the public has to say, and that's a good thing, and I encourage everyone to take advantage of the opportunity and have their say. It's one of the great advantages of living in Ontario.
Has government confirmed for you whether they will keep your position?
I have not received any communication about that in either direction.
Have you asked?
I rely on the statute. The statute is very clear that as a commissioner, I'm appointed unanimously by the members of the provincial legislature. I have a fixed contract for 5 years. I can only be dismissed for cause by the Assembly. I do not know of any cause.
And do you have any concerns that they would terminate this position? Or I don't mean terminate you, I mean the position, like.
I think that the Environmental Bill of Rights provides tremendous value for the people of Ontario. We see that even the old registry without very good software was being used 1,000 times a day. It's highly valued by the people of Ontario. I think we provide a useful service, and I hope that we will be allowed to continue to do so.
When is your term up?
In December 2020.
How much contact have you had with this government since they came into power?
Well, I've met with several of the cabinet ministers. I met with Minister Phillips on Friday. I am, of course, in regular contact with the civil service, who are my normal connections. I'm meeting Minister Jurek in a week or two. So, we have different jobs. We do them respectfully as best we can. Every ministry has a specific person whose job it is to be the liaison with my office. And as far as I know, those liaisons are continuing to work in the normal way. We provided the drafts of our report to the ministry in the normal way. We got comments in the normal way. You will see posted on our website the official comments of each ministry, and we expect to see the same with our other reports as we go forward in the year.
Can we go back to the government's plan to replace the climate change plan?
Yes?
You called the bill weak.
Yes?
Can you elaborate a bit more about why it's so problematic from your perspective that nothing is set in law, that it's all up to the discretion of the minister?
Well, you know, it's not just this government. All Ontario governments is a long tradition of people making grand announcements and then not meeting the targets and then quietly changing the targets before they arrive, so that they never have to say, well, we didn't meet it. So we know that governments can say lots of things, and if there's no consequences to changing what they say, they often change what they say. Another way of looking at it is we know that government cannot do the huge amount of work that's necessary both for climate mitigation and for adaptation by itself. It needs investment from the private sector. And the one thing the private sector has been absolutely clear about that they need is predictability and certainty. They make long-term investments. It takes a long time to make an investment. It takes a long time to pay back. And they need to be able to predict what the laws are going to be. Given the enormous upheaval we've just had and, you know, hundreds of contracts being torn up and a completed project, almost completed project being ordered by law to be torn down, there's a lot of uncertainty now about investment in Ontario. And if we do want people to invest in Ontario, at a minimum, they need to know where is the government going. Legal targets that are set by statute, as the United Kingdom law does, give an absolutely essential anchor so that short-term politics can't just erode it away. There's always another crisis. Right? My entire career, since I started in the Ontario government in 1975, which admittedly is a long time ago, everyone has always had a desk full of emergencies. There's always been something that's been more important than long-term things. And if we want action to really happen on long-term things, which we have to on climate change, we need some anchors that don't move. And the statute is the best thing we've got for that.
But they can change those as easily in a majority government, right?
It's not as easy as the government just making an announcement. I agree it's not perfect, but it's much better. And what we've seen in the United Kingdom is that even when there are changes of government, even when there are, you know, enormously opposing views about how society should be run, the legal target set in stone by the statute with the support of both parties has survived. The Climate Act has survived changes in government. The independent oversight by the Climate Change Committee is valued by the public. And so it's not all sweetness and light, it's not perfect, but it's the best thing that a parliamentary democracy can do that I know of.
Can you just talk a bit about the repeal of the Green Energy Act and what you think about the implications of that, maybe?
Well, to be honest, I haven't had a chance to study that. We've been working really hard to get this out. Most of the government had been very clear in its election campaign that it didn't support the Green Energy Act, and even the previous government had backed away from most of the contents of the Green Energy Act, even before the election. There's much bigger damage from retroactively undoing contracts that were signed as far back as 2010. And of course, as I show in the report, if you think about the large projects, so 10 of the projects that were canceled were the result of international competitions where we went around the world and invited people to invest in Ontario. And most of those projects were part owned by First Nations, who also put in years of work and talent and effort. And we're counting on those projects to bring money and jobs and dignity and self-reliance to their communities, and they've just been left high and dry. So, I think, as I reported last fall, reconciliation is a very important mandate for all of us, and environmental justice has to be part of that reconciliation, and these green energy projects were part of that. And nothing seems to be offered in their place.
Do we have, is there anything that would now either compel or encourage you know, any of our electricity system operators to turn to renewables, or is all of that now gone? Like, is there anything that would now still allow us to be even starting renewable projects?
Well, as you probably know, I did a report on electricity in April, and we put a number of recommendations in there. The government, the previous government, abandoned feed-in tariffs, and they proposed net metering instead, and in most circumstances, as currently proposed, net metering doesn't work. It's if the government allows virtual net metering, so groups can cooperate, and if it pays fairly for the electricity that's generated, then we may see a little bit. Electricity prices are likely to keep going up over time, I would guess. We certainly know that the Fair Hydro Plan borrowed a lot of money, which will have to be paid back, which will have to be paid. We know that there have been proposals in front of the Energy Board for increased rates, for example, for nuclear. So there are some organizations and community groups who, if the rules were set fairly, may still invest in renewable energy. And at the same time, we see renewable energy costs continuing to drop, not true to our credit, mostly because of China driving down the costs. And so even the Kentucky Coal Museum put solar on its roof to save money, so we may see some more of that as time goes on. Anybody else?
I have one last question. What does the photo behind you show?
Oh, this is Rockland last year, near Ottawa. All right, yes. Rockland.
Rockland, okay.
Okay. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much all for coming. I know there's lots of other things going on. If we can be of any further help to you, please let us know. Thank you.
Thank